and welcome to another session with us at Aucademy. I am Dr. Chloe Farahar. I am a white person with a shaved head, quite large glasses, and one of my favourite hoodies that says, no things, only stuff, games and snackos, because I want to do no things, just games and snackos, and actually talk to autistic people who have very interesting things to tell me. I am joined today by Katrine. If you wouldn't mind doing a physical description for us.
Of course, my name is Katrine Callander. I am a white cis woman. I'm originally from Denmark, which is why you will be hearing a little bit of an accent. I've got blonde hair, kind of typical Scandinavian traits, and in a green jumper, and feeling quite pleased to be able to speak to you here today. Thank you so much for having me, Chloe.
You are most welcome. And I actually do know Katrine. So you might, I don't know if you'll bring that up, I don't know, when we ask our key questions. So our key questions as typical are, obviously we know you're now Katrine, but what does that mean? So who are you and what is or are your dedicated interests?
So a little bit about me. Indeed, I do know you, and I know both Aucademy and the program you have been running at University of Kent. So you're autistic, because you were a very key part of my own autistic identification journey. So I wanted to thank you for that. So that's great. So as I mentioned, I'm originally from Denmark, and I've been living in the UK since 2001. I am a late diagnosed, or late identifying and then diagnosed autistic researcher in a field which, as we know, has historically neglected inclusive participation. I am a PhD student in social policy at the University of Kent under Professor Chrissie and Dr. Damian Milton, and I conduct participatory life story research on trauma, support, or rather the lack of it, and identity amongst late identifying autistic women. I'm also the mother of two mostly delightful neurodivergent teens, and generally just trying to navigate the demands of research work and the dynamics of being a neurodivergent single parent family with our various spiky profiles, which can be interesting.
I'm doing a PhD.
I'm doing a PhD, kind of minor detail, but just want to say that my self-identification and diagnosis was really positive, but it also prompted some really profound re-evaluation of my life experiences, and through my engagement with the autistic community, then I became aware of lack of certain support, which we will discuss about. So my personal experiences as an autistic woman included my research, and I consider the impact of this in terms of reflection and positionality and personal bias. I will also say I do love traveling, particularly by myself. I'm a reader, organizer, animal nature lover, walker, and constant pursuer of new project. Far too many, so I am desperately trying to balance self-care with my love of new and interesting focus areas to have some ADHD traits as well. So something new and shiny, I will go for it. So
yeah, half-finished projects, we know those. A lot of us know those. A neurodivergent by nature is half Danish and late identified at age 62 with two amazingly multiply neurodivergent adult sons. Lovely. Thank you. I will flag the topic for today, and then we'll jump into when did you discover you're autistic, because that might be, for some people it's a long description, for some people it's a short description, but just so people know what we're covering today. So we're talking about exploring autistic identity and trauma through narrative research. You'll explain what that means for us, so Katrine's going to do that. And just to flag as well that there are content notes of that there will be discussion of trauma and mental health. We're potentially also going to mention gender-based violence and sexual assault, but we're not going to be going into specifics. Okay, so we're just flagging that for people now, so you can think about where you're at in terms of if you're willing or able at this point in time to listen to those sorts of topics. But this is, the reason I've also, because you probably recognise that I haven't been doing live streams very much recently, in quite a few months actually, and I've had my own burnout and doing a lot of other work in other areas, but I've come on because this is a particular interest of mine as well. So autistic identity is something I'm really interested in, and how that impacts our well-being, and particularly the idea of what does trauma look like or mean for autistic people. So that's why I'm quite interested to hear about this from Katrine today. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But to our other question then, before we get into your topic, which is, when did you discover you were autistic?
Well, until the age of about 41, I never considered myself autistic. And looking back, I would probably have considered myself quite naive and ignorant in terms of the stereotypes regarding autistic identity. My children were initially diagnosed with ADHD. It took a long time for my daughter, because her kind of ADHD traits didn't show up as bouncing off the ceilings, as if essentially she wasn't a young white male boy. And ADHD was more disruptive in school settings. I was not at that stage aware of how autistic trait can manifest itself, particularly in women, and one. For me, for many people, it's a gradual discovery, and often linked to potentially kind of a particular autistic parents, very linked to their children's diagnosis. And for me, it was quite a bombshell moment. And I particularly remember the setting of one winter morning. I was on a dog walk and listening to a podcast to try and educate myself about supporting my neurodivergent children, who also do have autistic traits in addition to the ADHD. And the description of autistic women literally hit me like a sledgehammer. And I actually burst into tears on that frozen path, because I recognized the person reflected back at me. It was suddenly illuminating my life story through a lens that made sense, and I felt that I made sense. As I'm now aware that many of us do, I deep dived into exploring kind of what that meant for me, and particularly connecting with narratives, testimonies, stories of lived experience, of other experiences, and finding a deep recognition. Even though we all have very individual both profiles, but also kind of individual human experiences, that I've definitely recognized things in a way. But as I mentioned before, that reevaluation of life history also included considerations of trauma, and both fairly significant trauma events in themselves, but also cumulative trauma that built up over many years. There a constant dismissal of my lived experience, that no, it wasn't too loud or too bright or too kind of too much. So you learn not to listen to yourself, and in terms of marginalization and othering, things that just accumulate over the years. And I kind of wanted to explore this idea of how that impacts our sense of self-worth, our identity, and then when we do become aware of our autistic identity, the realignment and the kind of restructuring, but also the lack of trauma-informed care and lack of neurodivergent informed support at that stage, when really you're almost being re-triggered by reevaluating these events. So sorry, that was a lot. That was a long description, but kind of a little bit discussing kind of why I went into why I did, kind of, and why I thought it was important to explore.
And I think so many of us do that. I don't think there's very few people that go into doing, if we're lucky enough, if we're privileged enough, go into doing higher education or PhDs and things if they're not interested in the topic in some potentially personal way. So, and a lot of what you said, even just as I'm listening, I'm thinking, yeah, I know that. And then I'm thinking, but I'm now just, even in of itself, that, like I say, that reevaluation that a lot of us might do when we recognise we're autistic. Now, that can actually happen as well to people who are actually diagnosed or discovered as autistic young, and then they're not informed until later, or they don't recognise until later. And you do all that reevaluating of your life and realising, actually, that thing where I was invalidated at that point in time, when I was treated really badly, when I was bullied, when I was actually abused for being different, like I say, you're reliving that, but through a different lens. So even that's quite interesting, that I hadn't considered doing that reevaluating in and of itself could be quite traumatic for somebody, because you're now, like I said, I started looking back and getting very angry about how I'd been treated by people based on what was actually me being weird and being my autistic self. And I actually like the word weird, just to be clear, but that's a reclamation of that,
I
word.
like as well, actually. But yeah, absolutely. And I do think, even though I felt that it was a very positive experience to understand both about myself, I, very similar to yourself, became quite angry and frustrated about why hadn't this been discovered, what would have been different if I had understood. And you go through different stages of that identification process. But I do actually think that both the identification, but also the assessment process, the kind of diagnostic, we can have many discussions about diagnostic processes of autistic traits, because I think it has been come up before that many other things that I had to describe in the assessment were actually me being profoundly in a bad mental state, because they were trauma responses rather than me being a happy autistic person. But it does bring things up, and kind of there should be more support, because obviously there wasn't. Kind of, not for me, not for many others. You get a kind of, yes, you are autistic now, there you go. And it's up to us to kind of try to source that support. And often we find that within the autistic community, where we have to find it ourselves. And it can be a challenging time, reevaluating and positive and enlightening, but also challenging.
And I say that to a lot of people as well, because I do talk about the importance of obviously the autistic community for actually healing, but we also need to recognise that we are a lot of traumatised people as well. So it's about, how do we navigate looking after ourselves whilst also recognising other people may impact us as well when we come into the community. So it's quite a minefield. And I'm just thinking as well that it's almost like damned if we do, damned if we don't, because there's different struggles and trauma, and I don't use that word lightly. We're not using that word lightly at all in this discussion, for people listening or watching. But there's different trauma and struggles for later discovered or recognised autistic people, but there's also a lot of struggles and trauma for young recognised. It's really interesting because of the work that I do, and probably yourself as well, Katrine, but when you meet so many different types of autistic people from all different backgrounds and different profiles, that it just feels like really what we're talking about is that autistic people, regardless of whether we're recognised or not as autistic, sadly experienced struggles and trauma in a world that's not built for us yet, while a lot of us are trying to advocate for that change. Okay, because otherwise I'll go off on this lovely tangent, and then we won't get to see the things that we were interested in hearing about today. So you kind of mentioned already, but I don't know if you want to give us a little bit more background about why you chose this PhD topic. So if I flag the the banner for what we're talking about. So as a reminder, exploring autistic identity and trauma through narrative. What does that mean? And why did you choose it?
Indeed. So yes, I've given you a little bit of the background, my personal background for going this particular direction. But what I then came across before starting my PhD was that there was statistics on, or some statistics on, violence against autistic women, and one bit of research in particular kind of really struck a chord with me, that was published in 2022, that showed that 9 out of 10 autistic women had experienced sexual assault. So I felt that there were, when I looked into some of the, both in terms of that particular form, but also gender-based violence, and hence why we mentioned that as a topic, but we will talk about trauma more generally. That there were some statistics, but very few accounts of lived experience. Thankfully, we know that we are slowly moving in the right direction in terms of actual autistic kind of accounts, particularly online, and kind of a lot of so kind of more books and more social media profiles. But in terms of actual research that will be recognized and could potentially be taken into influence and recommendations for policy, I felt that that there was a need for academic research that includes these lived experiences. Particularly because, as I mentioned, I felt that the support around the time of adult identification and the assessment diagnosis isn't trauma informed. So despite this evaluation of personal history and the potential for retriggering trauma and bringing things that you might have buried quite deep within yourself and suddenly coming up to the surface. So I essentially want to try and influence change, try to provide recommendations for both social policy, but also kind of in terms of practice, and highlighting subjective narratives I think are really important. So that, because I also feel that we as autistic researchers need to be as visible as possible, and that the research that we do needs to be co-produced as much as possible, but most definitely participatory, and done within the community that we are part of. So hopefully the experiences are better understood and to improve those support structures. So that's my kind of aim, my aim with this work.
And I like that. And I think to clarify as well for people, it is a frustration for many of us as autistic people, but also those of us that are, like I say, privileged enough to be, say, autistic academics or researchers and so on. When what you're basically saying is, frustratingly, policymakers, etc., aren't likely to be looking for the amazing blogs, platforms, etc., which has such a wealth of knowledge from autistic people talking about their experiences and the people that they know as well in those experiences. So what you're trying to do is bring and center those voices so that the policymakers will actually listen as well and be like, look, we've done it in a way that you like, but also in a way that we want, which is you're doing narrative research. So listening to people. So it's not numbers crunching. It's number crunching has its place, but doing it as narrative. So that's really important. It's lovely.
So it's trying to build on some of the numbers and saying, all right, fine. So how do those numbers actually impact us as our lived experience, us as individuals? And now we can see the impact. What can we then do to improve them? And that stage will probably be in collaboration with other people further kind of afterwards. So hopefully there will be postdoctoral kind of work that can be done in this area.
And actually, I think we're seeing, because you said about, it's important as well that if an autistic academic feels safe to be openly autistic, so that there are quite a number now. It's not a huge number. There's a number of openly autistic people in the UK. We just had the amazing Jason Arday, who became the youngest professor at Oxford, who's a Black autistic man, which is just fantastic. But what I find really interesting is a lot of us are much more interested in the qualitative. We're much more interested as autistic academics in potentially doing research that's about centering the autistic voice in as many guises as possible, trying to, hear from all the different autistic profiles as well. So people with learning disabilities, people from other marginalised and intersectional communities. So I find that really interesting, given the stereotypes about what it's supposed to mean to be autistic, which is not to have empathy and, some of those stereotypes that we're only interested in maths and numbers. I'm terrible at maths, let inside down. So, yeah, fantastic. Have you kind of answered this, or?
I think I have. I think because I'm consider what was needed in autism research, and yes, we have kind of talked about it, that both us being visible, that we are here as autistic researchers, but it again, it can be a whole different conversation about whether to disclose. I'm very aware that it is not necessarily an option, and not everyone will feel comfortable, and there's still concerns about stigma, both as an autistic PhD student and also kind of working within higher education, whether you will be up for tenure if you kind of disclose that you're autistic. I've done some additional work on that, qualitative research on that. So it's interesting, the perspectives, but I think that the participatory aspect is increasingly recognized, and that we need more of it. So just to be part of that wave, I think is brilliant.
And you like you say, to be participatory and collaborative. So that's research with and by autistic people, as opposed to on us, as if we're like guinea pigs.
Also because also because it is not just about how we portray outwardly. It is about our internal experience, which I think historically, obviously, has very rarely been recognized. It's kind of so. Yeah,
fantastic. I did actually do I don't do interviews often. People, interestingly, I'm usually the interviewer, but I actually did one for somebody for their PhD in the States, and it was talking about the differences between autistic research and autism research and how they're different. And some of this discussion that we're having, which is the importance of collaboration and visibility and bringing in lots of different autistic perspectives, not just those of us that are able maybe to use math words. Fantastic. I was just, so it's quite nice doing this again. As I say, having low energy, but it's really nice to do this. So feel free to tell us then about some of the early themes that you're starting to see come through in your PhD, because you're second year.
I'm in the second year of the PhD, but I quite deliberately, because I was obviously doing a lot of literature review in the first year and kind of seeing what is currently out there, and I quite deliberately wanted to start my actual data collection, my talking to people very early, and kind of started that already in April, May of the first year, because almost as a bit of a pilot scheme of a core group of participants, because it is really important that what comes out is from the lived experiences of my participants. Need to be inductive, so I needed to come out of my research kind of academic head and impose my things on the data, and I needed to actually go out and talk to people. So that was what I did, and I wanted to share with you a little bit of a visual illustration of some of the early themes that have come up, and talk a little bit about how my brilliant participants have discussed them, and how I was kind of go into this and seeing what aspects of it will increase and develop over time. So, Thank you. So I hope everyone can see this. So on the kind of left hand side, we've got the kind of the aspects of the cumulative trauma, autistic lived experience in neuronormative society, as Chloe mentioned, kind of a society that isn't built for us. And in these aspects, I include both kind of individual traumatic events, and they could be both domestic abuse or gender-based violence, or even sadly sexual assault, but also the dismissal, the stigma, the disconnections, the stereotypes that can come up for us over a number of years. And in these blue bubbles is where I found the kind of the themes that were coming up, the things that people talked about. So if I start kind of up towards the top on the left hand side, in terms of stigma, my participants experienced stigma as a core aspect of both dealing with trauma, the autistic alienations, and the labels that have been placed upon them. And they describe both social isolation and internalized stigma, which I identified with as well. That very often kind of I ended up taking it upon myself to say kind of, well, there is something wrong with me because I had been told so frequently that I didn't belong, or I wasn't part of a social group. And experiencing stigma so frequently that my participants didn't feel that they had a voice when trying to process trauma or ask for support, and they expressed a fear of judgment and frequent invalidation, which often turned into internalized ableism, and they didn't. Almost came to a point where they didn't feel like they were in contact with that part of themselves that was pushed down quite significantly. And in terms of gendered othering, because kind of it was interesting that the role as I am speaking to primarily women. I also include individuals that identify as women, whether or not they were born or not in a female body. I considered also utilize kind of talking to people that were transgender. To be honest, I find that would be such a big topic that it's a whole PhD by itself, and I almost feel like the aspect of doing it from within your own community, that I maybe wasn't the right person to discuss those experiences, but I do feel that there's a need for discovering, for discussing, and keeping that a part of the discussion. They often define their life and identity, my participants, in relating to how the gender expectations that were placed upon them, and attitudes on family hierarchies and marriage roles and work relationships. And because quite a few, as we also know, that have been in the autistic community for a while, that they emphasize the intersectionality of identities, gender fluidity, not fitting into those gendered stereotypes. So those also became ways of othering, as well as more general, but also a gendered othering. And they discussed gendered in relation to their persistent masks, and the challenge was still having to conform to those social expectations and not talk about their trauma, because that is not what we do. There were significant overlaps in terms of being marginalized across many areas of my participants' lives, and not just in terms of their autistic traits. Across a lot of different aspects of life, they felt set apart from others. But in relation to trauma, the most frequent tendency was being marginalized through dismissal, lack of recognition, or blame. And I think that is not obviously not just an experience for the autistic community. I think that is often the case for us as particularly as women. But if you consider that the rates of violence and against us are significantly higher than for neuronormative parts of society, that becomes a very significant challenge and something we maybe often live with, but again, because we might have learned to suppress parts of ourselves, we also suppress those traumatic experiences, and don't reach out for support. I also spoke to people about the concept of disability, and particularly being kind of invisibly disabled, both in terms of feeling disabled internally, in terms of traits having to be managed, but primarily being disabled by society, and for not accommodating their needs. And again, I found that really resonating as well as with myself as an autistic woman, that I can manage my own traits relatively well, particularly here after I learned to identify them and understand the processes I have to go through to manage to manage my own needs. But it can feel extremely disabling to not have those needs recognized. Some struggled with the label of disability because support needs fluctuate so significantly, and things that they might be able to do one day, well, you might not be able to another. Kind of, Chloe, you talked about just having gone through a period of burnout. I've been going through some health issues, mental health issues recently as well. And where I sometimes feel, for example, yes, I'm working, yes, I'm a parent, yes, I can help and kind of support my own neurodivergent teenagers. I can do my PhD, but I can also crash and sit and rock in a corner and not being able to deal with anything. But I feel that because I generally can do those other things, I find it hard to ask for help when I can't. So that the growing recognition in myself and for my participants as well of overcoming that internalized ableism. Let's say it's a work in progress and very much connected to identity. So I will be considering kind of the term disability as a social construct, as how we see it by ourselves, how we see it in relation to society. And one other aspect that particularly related to the notion of late identification and a late diagnosis is the sociological concept of biographical disruption. And that is used quite frequently in medical sociology if people have experienced a very significant accident or health, some kind of change in their physical health, and how people cope mentally with that. And I wanted to stress that kind of this is not identification and diagnosis is both seen by me and by my participants as not being a negatively disrupting experience, but it is a disrupting experience no matter what. It changes the course of your awareness of yourself, very often in a positive way, but there is a shift that can take some time to process. And they considered the reevaluation of self-identity and gradually increased self-acceptance. but also, as you mentioned previously, the frustration and anger about misconception and lack of support throughout their lives, and processing those feelings, and also kind of whether to address that if your parents are still around, if your wider network is still around. Do you approach them? Do you bring that up? There's some that had talked to their families, or kind of wider circle of wider network about it, and some that didn't. There were some whose parents have passed away, and that unresolved connection. And then I will also say there was quite a few that then started recognizing neurodivergent traits in their wider circle, kind of both a family and the people that they have connected with throughout their in social life. So it was both a disruption, a biographical disruption of the identification diagnosis, but also looking back at the traumatic events throughout their lives and how those had caused disruptions and changes of life directions, and looking at it with a new lens. And I think sometimes a couple of things that came up was forgiving yourself for not having reacted in a way that you felt that you maybe should have at the time, or accepting that that was the way you needed to react at that time, and that was what that was you protecting yourself, was really important. I think that very often came up, in particular in terms of gender-based violence. If there's some things that if you maybe didn't fight or bring it to the police or bring it to the kind of a criminal or psychological kind of services, because you have had many different experiences and different maybe didn't trust people very much because of the dismissal, and learning to live with understand those understandings of yourself, and those disruptions throughout life was something that we talked quite a lot about. So essentially, this is the aspect of one more in terms of embodiment as well. Some participants describe living in their head rather than in their body, and feeling a dissociation with their own body and expressions of bodily sensations, again linked to the dismissal that we'd experienced. So we couldn't say whether it was too hot or too bright or too loud, or kind of that we were invalidated. So we have almost learned to not listen to ourselves. And then now trying to get in touch with ourselves after identification, after kind of like, okay, so what do I want my identity to be? What do I need? Okay, I'm going to put it and walk around with sunglasses, even though the sun's not shining, but I'm finding it too much. I am going to put my headphones on. I need to remove myself from this big group of people, and acknowledging what you need in a physical space, as well as mental health protection of yourself. And this was particularly the aspect of embodiment, particularly for experiences of more significant trauma. And yeah, accepting yourself and setting boundaries as a core part of your autistic identity. I have had it said to me before that in the last 3 years I have become more autistic. It's like, yes, absolutely. That is because I am setting the boundaries that I really need, rather than trying to override them. So those aspects, those kind of 6 topics, and what has currently emerged in terms of the themes that have come back, looking back over the history of my participants and kind of their narratives. And the other 4 ones are really trying to move beyond that, the kind of potential of authentic autistic reclaiming of agency, the sense making, the autistic selfhood, the authenticity, because that's where And that's where I see the value of narratives and testimony as being really important. Now, I know I've talked for quite a bit, so do you have any, before I continue on these last bits, do you have any particular questions?
Just a couple of things, and it's really interesting, and we've had a couple of people as well on YouTube saying things, just kind of interested or identifying with some of the things that you've said. So TW on YouTube said, you know, living in the head, so true. Amanda says bodies can be very unsafe places to be in so many ways. So I think a lot of people, Maddie here saying we also learn from very early on to ignore our needs. There's a lot of what you're saying feels like it's resonating with people. And earlier on, Amanda as well was also saying, when you were talking about the need, obviously, to learn about our experiences from the inside. So Amanda was saying, it seems to me that autism is an internal experience, not externally observable traits. So some of the things that you've already mentioned. So I found the term, I've not heard that term before, so I found the term biographical disruption really interesting. And like you say, it doesn't necessarily mean that disruption to your story, your narrative, your life has to be necessarily negative, but it is a disruption. It's you re-evaluating, it's you looking at your life with a new lens, and that in itself can be exhausting. Even if it's positive, it's still a disruption. So I found that really interesting. I personally identify with that as well. And then it made me think of, because you were saying that some people worry that maybe, and I hear this actually quite a lot from different people in the different capacities of the different roles I have, people worrying that when they do recognize they're autistic, or they're told, again, because some people are recognized when they're younger, potentially worrying that they're not having the correct reaction, the correct feeling or thoughts, or whilst trying to navigate that new information about themselves. And I want to be clear as well, and I know this is what you're saying as well, Katrine, but I want to be clear to everybody, however you react is how you react, and it's perfectly valid and understandable. So I just flagged for people, I'm afraid the link is quite long, so I'm just flagging for people because of all this amazing work that I do, I'm very privileged and lucky to meet lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of autistic people from all across the globe in different capacities. And I am a bit of a stereotype in the sense I do pattern spot, and so I recognise some of the common reactions that we might have to autistic discovery. Now, just because they're common reactions doesn't mean, if you can't see yourself listed, that your reaction is incorrect. It was more to show people that being angry when you discover you're autistic is valid, being upset, being depressed, all these things are perfectly understandable and valid responses, as well as recognising and feeling conflicting things like, phew, I understand now, and this is why I've struggled so much, and now I can put in boundaries. So if people are interested, we'd have that Common Reactions of Discovery blog. The link on the screen is actually quite long. So what I would say is, if you just go to aucademy.co.uk and do a search for Common Reactions, you should find the blog, and then feel free to put in a comment and say, none of these reactions reflect anything I experienced. Absolutely fine. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting, let's just take that off the screen. I think you're going to come to this anyway, which is some of that sort of practical implications for what you found. So I don't know if I bring this up now and then we come back to it, but the practical implications, what I'm hearing potentially anyway from my head in terms of the work that I do, is the importance of trauma-informed discovery of your autistic self. So my note that I made for myself is, I don't mean limited to diagnosis, but I just mean if you are recognizing you're autistic, hopefully you've got support to do that, whether that's part of finding us as a community or just one other person, but having that sort of trauma-informed, this is going to potentially bring up some very difficult thoughts and or feelings that you might not know how to process or even know what you're feeling, and that's also okay. But also that the diagnostic process, if people decide to go down that route, if you're privileged enough to go down that route, depending on where you are on the globe, that diagnostic process should also be trauma informed, in the sense of recognizing that we are very likely to have had cumulative, so lots of traumatic life experiences or multiple invalidations of our experiences. So the diagnosticians and clinicians recognizing that, but also that the discovery and the diagnosis process itself can be a source of trauma for people.
Yeah.
Does that sound like an okay summary? They were just the two things that kind of really.
Yes, absolutely. And I realized that it absolutely is not just related to the diagnosis. It is because many of us are obviously just self-identifying and don't feel there's a need for a diagnosis, and it's just as valid. I'm just thinking that it had just actually occurred to me that some people that who might want to try to go for a diagnosis and can't go down the private route. Obviously, there's a quite significant long waiting list, but I was very privileged that I was able to find the money to go private. So I recognize that privilege. But during that process of waiting, there could really be an improved support from based on the of recognition of this process, and I don't really feel that is actually taking place at the moment. As we mentioned earlier, thankfully there is an increased range of books and blogs and social media posts and communities such as Aucademy, where and I think that was why you originally set it up, to provide information on autistic lived experience. And both myself and many others have significantly benefited from that. So,
and importantly, for free.
Yes,
because like you say, it's a privilege that some of us can't access certain
absolutely.
resources as well, but also out of selfishness of my part, because I just love listening to autistic people have with all their interesting topics and things as well.
That's also why I put all my kind of presentations and my writings up on ResearchGate and on my website, which is kind of in the kind of like blurb thing, that I want you to be able to see what I have and what just my thoughts, which are only from my perspective and those of my participants, but trying to shine some light on some of these lived experiences, and for us to maybe some people find that they can identify with certain aspects, and that illuminates their experiences a little bit better, and that's amazing. And hopefully we can try to work towards getting improved support structures for ourselves.
Can I just add then that I can see that this would be interesting and potentially quite validating and helpful for autistic people, and also neurotypical people, in getting them to understand the types of support and why. So very important.
So there might be a training program to be developed in terms of trauma informed, how to provide trauma informed support, and some of the things to consider, because it is multifaceted, where and just like we are multifaceted individuals. But if you're all right, then I'll jump into some of the more positive aspects and kind of looking forward, and what I feel that that exploring our experiences through these narratives has the potential to do. That reclaiming agency and authenticity was one of the central aspects of the narratives of my participants. Particularly after significant or a lot of cumulative trauma, which removed their agency. There was a lot of anger in taking back that autonomy and self-determination, but also a lot of power in trying to reclaim that. As I mentioned before, many struggled with the internal ableism, and I think even after many years of being identifying, I will if I may kind of give a personal example, then I always feel like I only have worth in relation to what I do for others, or what I can produce, or what I can do, that I don't have worth in myself. And therefore I decided to kind of remind myself on a daily basis, and I got it tattooed on my arm to say, know your worth. Because just as a daily little reminder to myself that I have value in myself, and I'm enough in myself. But many of my participants, they started to define themselves beyond the constraints of external perceptions. Some felt it was a purely internal process, particularly when and some was in relation to interacting with neurotypical society. So kind of it was both things that were going on for themselves and how they reacted, and kind of trying to evaluate and reflect on personal experience. And some was in relation to when do we tell others, how do we react in terms of others, and when do we kind of state our needs and our agency and reclaim our voice. But they found this reauthoring their identities both empowering and transformative, and both as an autistic individuals, but also as a trauma survivor, and embodying that and having control over the descriptive language, and kind of like improved self-advocacy. And that particular came in terms of talking to other autistic women that had experienced similar aspects. I was actually really worried that my research would be difficult for these women I've talked to, and I have extensive kind of distress protocols and kind of resources for contact. And thankfully, so far, they have expressed that it's been really therapeutic and really kind of positive to be able to talk about some of these aspects, because it's not something that we are really considered to be allowed to talk about in normal societies. So be able to share some of these experiences and kind of and receive understanding, ableism. Yes.
Don't worry, Katrine, just ignore the comment. That's why I moved it so it covers me and not you.
Yeah, that's right. And my participant found that their autistic identification was a significant part of personal growth in connection with community and self-concept. So the reason why narratives were so important, and why I deliberately work with people on multiple interviews over an extended period of time. I've actually gone down to part-time kind of PhD just to be able to do my data collection and my interviewing, my conversations over an extended period of time, because it changes for us as well. The experience I had of my lived or kind of experience as my artistic identity a year ago is different to it is today. But narratives, they were emphasized by my participants of being of core importance to understand their own life history. And I find that it's crucial in relation to research, and to talk about the life history narrative, the testimony over time, how these experiences are not just in isolation, but part of a wider experiences of how we have reached the identity, the things we identify with now, and realigning those by considering kind of all the way from childhood, and kind of how that kind of also has then impacted on later experiences. And many agreed that reading and listening to and engaging with personal life stories and perspectives were a significant key to understanding their own neurodivergence. And they strongly believe that sharing our subjective lived experiences are one of the primary paths to challenging the stereotypes that we find. I was very privileged to be able to do a presentation at Autistic this summer, the conference for and by autistic people. And what I did, I talked about these things, but as well as conversing about it ourselves, myself, just talking to people about it, I asked people for discussions, kind of. So I raised all these points up, and there was so much recognition from people's individual experience. It became one big sharing experiences between these kind of 35 odd people that were able to share it with me. So that was really, really validating, because I think the engagement, the validation from our community is incredibly important. So I think that is where I see the sense making and authenticity coming through.
I just wanted to add to that, actually, because you just said something and I'd made a note, because you're saying about obviously the importance for your participants, for instance, in them feeling they could tell their stories and how it helps them in this. But I've also made a note that might be particularly important for those of us who've never felt heard or seen.
Yeah.
And that actually that might be one of the first times, if not ever, that we might feel heard and seen. And that is invaluable when you're talking about all these different things, you know, the hidden disability, the internalized ableism, the fact that we've been othered and potentially not our authentic selves. So I think, because I was just thinking about when I did again, I actually, if I knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't get a diagnosis, but I do have a diagnosis. How other discussions on other videos, on other lives that we've done, where I'll explain why I would change my mind now. But the only thing I think I found potentially valuable in that diagnosis was just having a captive audience to just talk and potentially hear me. I don't think they heard me, though, the way the autistic community does. And the reason I say that is because of how my story was reflected in my diagnostic assessment. Like the document is not necessarily, I didn't necessarily feel heard the way if I describe my autistic experience to other autistic people and then be able to say without judgment, oh, I get that, or I don't get that, or what does that mean, or what does that feel like, or, you know, all these kinds of things. You fit, that's much more, you're being heard. So yeah, sorry, it was just because as you were saying that, I was thinking, yes, potentially that idea that it could be therapeutic, but also just the fact that they might feel that they are actually being heard for the first time.
Absolutely. I do think that the aspects of peer support from within our community is incredibly important. So I know that we've now kind of come up to the hour, so we won't. I'm sure we could talk about all of these aspects for a very long time, but if I'm all right, I hope I would take just a minute to just put a little personal reflection. I think I sent you a little, because it's beneficial for people to be able to read. And I know I benefit from that, but just want to read this out, that for me, the development of a new internal and social self means that I search for ways to achieve personal balance separate from the pressures of social expectations. And this is a very extended process of reflection that includes acknowledging the validity of my own lived experience. And the previous ownership of my trauma experience is gradually being replaced, one little positive self-affirmation and acceptance at a time. And it has been a relief to understand and accept that my lifelong feeling of alienation has a name, a community, a way to understand and accept mine and other autistic people's challenges as well as strengths. So the core of my identification beyond trauma, or if you can say beyond, with kind of an experience, an understanding of trauma, may lay in autistic acceptance, connection and relief that this lifelong othering is no longer just a solitary burden, and owning my narrative and advocating both for myself and for my community is, for me, self-determined resilience and power. Hope that was all right to share with you guys.
It was. It's lovely, really lovely. And Neurodivergent by Nature is just saying how eloquently put. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
No, this, yeah, it's very interesting, very powerful stuff. And because obviously you come at it from a different sort of method, a different methodology to some of the work that I might do, and potentially different frameworks. So it's interesting to hear some of the things that I've potentially seen or heard. But you've got some terms for it. So like I say, I really like this. I know it's not necessarily your term per se, but this biological disruption.
Yeah, it's trying to kind of utilize some of the sociological terms, and some from psychology and some from sociology, and kind of how we can utilize that in terms of again, it is for us to explore our lived experience, but also for others in neuronormative society to understand what our needs actually are by framing them in ways that might be understood in some other ways. If I may put a little plug that I am still looking for participants. So if anyone are interested in being involved in this and talking to me, then you can go on the website that is on the kind of and have a look at a bit more of a description and all the information for the participant information sheet.
And yeah, I think I'm just seeing lots of crossovers, and just finding it really interesting because I did, and it was more about myself, and it was my own self-reflections as well. But I have written about healing from the culture of autism and our othering. Before you even know that you're autistic, you still have autisticness, right? And so I've written about and spoken about healing from the culture of autism via the autistic community. And when we say that, we don't mean like we're just this big homogenous mass. It means finding community and making community where you can, and that might be just two of you. It might be largely online. It can look like all sorts of things. But that idea of narrative, and I'd recognise some things. I'll really briefly explain what I'm talking about, because otherwise I sound like I'm waffling. So basically, people might already, I know you know Annette because you've met Annette, but Dr. Annette Foster, autistic, ADHD, all sorts of different pie ingredients that makes up Annette. And they did a group performance. I was included in that group performance, Adventures of Super Auti Gang, and they write really negative words and phrases that have been used about them throughout their life in permanent Sharpie marker all over their body. So they're an artist, right? And amazing at it. And I asked them, just really, I hadn't thought about it. I just was like, oh, you've got some space there. Can you put some of the words of mine that had been used against me before I knew I was autistic on your shoulder? And it was only like a year or so later, because I was looking at pictures that we had at this performance, that I recognized the significance of what I'd asked. And it was that I'd asked another autistic person to share the burden of really quite hurtful and damaging things that had been said, and words and behaviours and things like that. So I then started to do this talk on healing from the culture of autism in words and pictures, and about the importance of finding other autistic people, and not being alone in your autisticness. And I'm just thinking, if people are interested in this kind of stuff, then Katrine is saying that they are, still looking, if you're interested, in being able to tell your story and be heard, I think is really powerful. So for those who can't read it on the screen, it's www. You don't need that bit, but Katrine, so Katrine, and then Callander, so CALLANDER.com. We've just done it in capital K and C on the screen so you can read it more easily, but you don't need the capitals when you do a URL. But also people might be interested in Sonia Bouet's work. So Sonia does this in a very arts-based way as well, which is sort of working out your identity and your narrative through photography, and they've got a whole program and a booklet that you can do. And I'm just thinking there's lots of ways that people can do this. I'm just going to flag Sonia Bouet, who we've had on, and remember, if we're talking about people here, they are neurodivergent. So Sonia Bouet's work, which is, I think it's called neurophotography? I can't remember now. I'm really sorry, but it's a really long word that I think it's like neurophotography, something like that.
Yeah,
do you have any further hopes? Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, kind of the one thing that has come up and that I will explore a bit further as I go through the data collection is both individual journaling and not sitting down in an interview face to face. That some people prefer to communicate in writing and don't want to do kind of video interviews, and that's perfectly all right. So it can also be in writing. It can also be that you kind of do photo illustration, so things that expresses how you feel, and art-based. I had in my MA dissertation, I also had one of my brilliant participant that had done some stitching, some sewing, and expressing both some words and some kind of an illustration of feelings and emotions, and for other ways to express some of the things that have experienced. So a narrative doesn't necessarily have to mean a written narrative or a spoken narrative. It can be in many different formats of how we express ourselves.
And that's lovely, because I really want to, I say this like I've got any time or energy, but there's always, like you said, projects in the back of your mind. And yeah, I'm always thinking about the very, very unheard voices. And again, when I say voices, I don't necessarily mean mouth words. I don't even necessarily mean communication in any traditional sense of the word. So I'm always thinking of those within our community that are very, very unheard. And so, yeah, I like that we're going to keep trying this and bringing people together. Absolutely. Oh, lovely. Thank you. Neurodivergent by Nature has also flagged it's neurophototherapy. Thank you. Neurophototherapy. I knew it was neuro something. So soniabouet.co.uk. Thank you, Neurodivergent by Nature. And it's neurophototherapy is the work that they did. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So TW, a really great discussion. Thank you both for bringing depth and clarity to narrative research. Oh, lovely. Obviously, I mentioned I can see practical applications of getting people to understand whether they're autistic themselves, some of the things that you discussed, but also that need to be trauma informed and some of those elements when it's a diagnostician or a mental health professional. So the practical ways that people can take what you found. Do you have any other thoughts or hopes for your research before we wrap up?
Well, it might be useful for providing recommendations for definitely for use of trauma-informed and neurodivergent informed support, because even if we can't see the trauma-informed as being separate to the neurodivergent formed support, because unfortunately I also think that there's still support which is from a medical and pathologizing focus. So I think that is really important that we continue, as I know that you and many others do, to share the social understanding and the social paradigm of autistic experience and neurodiversity. It's both, as we've mentioned, that other neurodivergent women, or not just women, that in neurodivergent individuals may recognize themselves and their lived experience, potentially feel just a little bit less othered and less marginalized and less, and if that can encourage someone to just find it has encouraged me to find my own voice more frequently. And if some of the things that we talk about can encourage others to recognize boundaries, to recognize needs, to find their voice and their agency, and kind of advocate for them for themselves, for ourselves, then I think it's really, really valuable. So hopefully I can be part of a growing movement of autistic researchers and influencing the direction of research and wider conversations about trauma, about identity, and about autistic experience in general. So
yeah, I do see this from non-autistic autism researchers potentially having some getting nervous about the number of us now, that we're small, but we can be quite noisy, and trying to actually make change so that we get the research that all of our community needs, not just those of us that are largely able to use mouth words as well, because there's a lot of concern that, well, what if we talk over people who don't have the means to communicate their needs and things. But actually I want us to be looking at that as well as researchers.
I was the
because
chair.
Non-autistic people aren't
at Aucademy for a session for a young autistic man who had who was speaking just via the kind of computer, and he wasn't able to use mouth words, but he was able to do a session kind of using his interpreter, and it worked really well. We were able to just communicate how much of his experience still resonated with so many of us, in however ways we communicated.
Yeah, love it. I'm very well. I was having a bit of a tough day today because, again, you feel like sometimes you're sort of just screaming into the ether and not really getting anywhere, but then it's quite nice to have conversations with people who are also trying, and that's why it's also important to talk to other, again, when I say talk, don't necessarily mean mouth words, but communicate and connect with other autistic people so that you really aren't just feeling very alone in whatever it is you're trying to do, whether that's advocating for yourself, that's huge, or whether that's advocating for other people as well, and particularly very marginalized people in our community. It can be very, very lonely. But yeah, having this conversation has actually buoyed me a little bit more today. So thank you everyone very much. We're just going to do our very final question and ask Katrine, what is your latest or most current or favourite stim?
Oh yes, one thing when you asked me that previously, and I considered it, and kind of I either need a lot of silence, a lot of time to myself, a lot of kind of like time to reflect, or I need very loud, heavy rock music. It drives my children absolutely crazy, and they have told me off many times for blasting it out in the car, kind of turning up at school, blasting out very heavy rock music. But it is somewhere I can just deep dive and feel within the sound, and I can actually find it. So it can be either that I need the silence or something really impactful.
Lovely. And I love doing this because it's so interesting to hear people's stims, because or at least what's their favorite or current stim. And the reason, again, is just to break down that we're just this monolith that all do or like the same things. So my stims tend to be much more tactile. Other people's might be more auditory, so sound. And I think that's really important that we actually share and hear everybody's different stims. I don't necessarily have a new current stim. I have a new toy. I say a toy. I've been lucky enough and privileged enough to get access to work money as a disabled person, and I actually have a lot of back problems, back pain, and I have done since I was in my 20s. And I've got an amazing standing electronic desk, which I think I've only had it. I've been using it for the last couple of days, and I've a lot less pain today. Touch wood. So I'm quite happy about that, because it obviously we're not necessarily disabled only by our autistic selves in a world that doesn't suit us, but also we're more likely to have physical disabilities as well. Oh yeah, lovely. Just somebody's saying they just caught the end. What a great conversation. You're most welcome. But they'll be back to watch from the start. You are most welcome. So thank you everybody ever so much. Thank you, Katrine. Feel free to stay on. And I have no idea what the next session is, so you'll just have to have a nice surprise, because Ben, our lovely autistic Aucademy elf, will let us know what that is in time. Play us out, please, Ben.